The day Lavinia Hurst rode into Caldwell, Kansas with nothing but a cracked leather saddlebag, a loaded derringer tucked into her boot, and a letter she had been too afraid to open for 3 weeks. The sky above the prairie turned the color of a bruise, and every soul in town felt the change in the air before the first crack of thunder ever split the horizon. It was the spring of 1878, and the cattle trails were alive with dust and the smell of money, and men with hard eyes moved through Caldwell like weather systems, dangerous and unpredictable. The town sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail, and it wore its roughness like a badge, all sun-bleached storefronts and muddy streets, and the distant lowing of longhorns being pushed north. Lavinia had heard about Caldwell from a woman in Wichita who had pressed the name of the town into her palm like a secret, whispering that there was work there for women who were not afraid of hard things. Lavinia was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair that she pinned back with a pair of tortoiseshell combs her mother had left her, and gray eyes the color of storm clouds that people often mistook for cold, until they looked long enough to find the warmth underneath. She was not beautiful in the soft, parlor-painting way that men wrote poems about. She was beautiful in the way the plains were beautiful, wide and honest and capable of surprising you completely when you had stopped expecting anything at all. She had come from St. Louis, though she never talked about why she had left. There had been a man there, a man with clean hands and a borrowed reputation, and when his debts had swallowed what little she owned, she had taken the derringer that had belonged to her father, and she had walked out of the boarding house where she had been staying, and she had not looked back. That had been 6 weeks ago. Since then she had worked her way west on coaches and horses, and once, the back of a freight wagon that smelled of turpentine and old wood, stopping in small towns long enough to earn a few dollars before the restlessness in her chest sent her moving again. The letter in her saddlebag was from her cousin Edna, who lived outside of Caldwell on a small homestead she shared with her husband, Roy. Lavinia had written to Edna before leaving St. Louis, telling her she was coming, but she had not heard back until the letter caught up to her in a post office in Dodge City, handed to her by a postmaster with flour on his apron who looked at her with the kind of curiosity that made her feel like a specimen under glass. She had taken the letter and walked outside into the bright noon light and had not opened it. Something in the weight of it, the small thickness of it against her fingers, had frightened her. What if Edna said no? What if there was no place for her here either? She rode into Caldwell now with the letter still sealed, and she told herself she would open it only once she had found a place to sleep and something to eat. The main street was called Exchange Avenue, and it ran straight and proud through the middle of town like a spine. On either side of it sat saloons and general stores, a hotel called the Southwestern, a barber shop, a land office with a hand-painted sign that had begun to peel at the corners, and a cattle broker's office that seemed to be doing more business than anywhere else on the street. Cowboys in trail-dusted clothes moved in and out of the saloons, with the easy confidence of men who knew that Caldwell was as far as the law was willing to follow most of them. Lavinia tied her horse, a sturdy roan mare she called Bess, to the hitching post outside the Southwestern Hotel and pulled her saddlebag over her shoulder. She pushed through the door into the dim interior, where a ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, and the smell of tobacco and kerosene hung in the air. The man behind the front desk was small and bespectacled, and he looked at her the way people often looked at a woman traveling alone, with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant respect. "I need a room," Lavinia said, and her voice was calm and even the voice of a woman who had learned that showing uncertainty was a cost she could not afford. "$1.50 a night," the man said. "In advance." She counted out the coins without flinching, and he handed her a key attached to a small block of wood with the number 4 carved into it. Her room was small and clean enough, with a window that looked out over the alley between the hotel and the barbershop next door. There was a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt and a washstand with a ceramic pitcher, and Lavinia sat down on the edge of the mattress and pulled Edna's letter out of her bag, and finally, with hands that were only slightly unsteady, broke the seal. The letter was written in Edna's looping, cheerful hand, but the words it carried were not cheerful at all. Roy had been thrown from his horse in February and had broken his back. He was alive but could not work. Edna was managing the homestead on her own, and she had 2 children under the age of 6, and she was barely keeping things together. She had written that she could not take Lavinia in, not right now, not with things the way they were. She had written it with apologies pressed into every line, and Lavinia could feel how much it had cost her cousin to say no. Lavinia folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the saddlebag. She sat very still for a long moment, listening to the sounds of Caldwell outside her window, the distant whoop of cowboys, the clatter of wagon wheels, the ever-present wind off the prairie that pushed against the glass like something that wanted in. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and went back downstairs to find out what kind of work a town like this had to offer a woman like her. The man behind the front desk told her that the Drover's Rest, 2 blocks down Exchange Avenue, sometimes needed a woman to help with the cooking and the laundry. He said it with the careful neutrality of a man who wanted to be helpful without implying anything improper, and Lavinia thanked him and walked the 2 blocks down to the Drover's Rest, which turned out to be a combination saloon and boarding house that smelled considerably better than most of the establishments she had passed. The owner was a heavy-set woman named Mee Duffy, who had iron-gray hair and quick brown eyes that took Lavinia's measure in approximately 4 seconds. "You cook?" Mee asked. "Well enough," Lavinia said. "You handle yourself around men who have had too much whiskey." "I grew up with 4 brothers," Lavinia said. Mee smiled, the expression brief and sharp and genuine. "You can have the back room and $3 a week plus meals. You start tomorrow." Lavinia started that evening. She spent the first few days learning the rhythms of the Drover's Rest, the way the morning was for cleaning and the afternoon was for cooking, and the evening was when the cowboys came in off the trail, and the saloon filled with noise and smoke and laughter, and occasionally the simmering tension that came before a fight. She was good at the cooking, better than she had let on to me, and she found that the work settled something in her, the physical satisfaction of feeding people, of watching them eat what she had made. She had been there 5 days when Lewis Thatcher walked through the door. She did not know his name yet. She knew only that he was tall, taller than most of the men who came through, with the kind of lean, rangy build that spoke of years spent in the saddle. He had dark hair that was longer than fashion strictly dictated, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from something harder than ordinary bone, and he wore a brown duster that was trail-worn, and a hat pushed back on his head at an angle that suggested he had not been thinking about his hat when he put it on. He had a quiet about him that was different from the quietness of the dangerous men she had learned to be wary of. His quietness felt earned rather than threatening, the quietness of a man who had decided that most things were not worth saying out loud. He sat down at the end of the bar and asked me for coffee rather than whiskey, and me raised an eyebrow but poured it without comment. Lavinia was carrying a plate of biscuits out from the kitchen when she caught him looking at her. Not in the way that some of the cowboys looked at her, with that calculated appraisal that made her want to put her hand near her boot. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something that has surprised them, briefly and honestly, and then he looked away when he noticed she had caught him. She set the biscuits on the counter and went back to the kitchen. Over the next several evenings he came in at the same time, ordered coffee and whatever was on the menu for supper, and sat at the end of the bar with the quiet self-containment of a man accustomed to his own company. Lavinia learned from me that his name was Lewis Thatcher, and that he ran cattle for a rancher named Harlan Cross, whose outfit was camped 3 miles south of town, waiting for the market prices to improve enough to make it worth pushing the herd the rest of the way north. "Thatcher's been driving cattle since he was 17, me told her one morning while they were kneading dough. He's one of the good ones. Doesn't cheat at cards, doesn't bother women who haven't asked to be bothered, doesn't look for trouble, She paused and gave the dough a firm push with the heel of her hand. He's also been alone since his wife passed about 4 years back. Fever took her. They didn't have children. Lavinia did not say anything to that. She kept kneading the dough and thought about the way he had looked at her and then looked away. On the 6th evening, she brought his coffee out herself instead of leaving it for the young boy who usually ran drinks. She set it down in front of him and he looked up, and close up she could see that his eyes were a dark, warm brown, the color of good leather in afternoon light. "You're the woman who's been doing the cooking," he said. It was not a question exactly, more an observation offered as a conversation. "I am," she said. "The biscuits are the best I've had since Abilene," he said, and she could tell from the directness of it that he was not the kind of man who gave compliments lightly or often. "My mother's recipe," she said. "She put a little too much butter in them. I kept the mistake." Something shifted in his expression, a slight easing, and he said, "Lewis Thatcher," and extended his hand. "Lavinia Hurst," she said, and shook it. His hand was very warm and calloused in the way of someone who had worked with rope and leather for a long time. He nodded once and she went back to the kitchen, and she stood there for a moment with her hands braced on the edge of the work table and breathed carefully, which was ridiculous, she told herself. Perfectly ridiculous. But she had felt something when he said her name, some small tremor in the place behind her sternum that she had not felt in a very long time, and she did not quite know what to do with it. Lewis Thatcher had not planned to linger in Caldwell as long as he had. The cattle market was slow, and Harlan Cross was a patient man when patience served him. But Lewis was restless in the particular way of a man who has spent too long between one place and the next without landing anywhere. He was 30 years old and he had been driving cattle since he was 17, had worked the Kisham Trail 11 times in those 13 years, had seen enough of the country between Texas and Kansas to know every shade of grass and every color of sunset between the Red River and the Arkansas. He was good at his work. He was respected among the men who did the same work. And he was, in ways that he had learned to carry quietly and without complaint, profoundly lonely. Eleanor had been his wife for 2 years before the fever took her in the summer of 1874. She had been a gentle, cheerful woman who had loved wildflowers and disliked the sound of wind at night, and he had loved her honestly and well, and when she died he had folded that part of himself up and put it somewhere interior where it would not interfere with the work. He had not unfolded it since. He did not know what it was about Lavinia Hurst that made him feel the edges of that folded thing stirring, as if it had noticed something and was deciding whether to pay attention. She was not soft the way Eleanor had been soft. There was something direct and undeceived about her, something in the steadiness of her gray eyes and the way she moved through the crowded rooms of the Drover's Rest with a calm efficiency that never tipped into coldness. She had clearly been through something. He could tell that much, the way you could tell a horse had been through hard weather by the set of its head, but whatever it was had not broken her. It had just made her more careful. He found himself coming in earlier in the evenings, not by much, but early enough to be there when she brought his coffee out. She began to bring it out herself every evening without either of them acknowledging that this had become a thing that happened. They talked in the brief intervals between her duties, conversations that were short but substantial, the way conversations between people who choose their words carefully always are. She told him she was from St. Louis. He told her he was from a small town in southern Texas that most maps did not bother including. She asked him what the cattle business was like this time of year, and he told her about the drives, the weeks of walking slowly north with thousands of animals, the dust and the river crossings and the particular beauty of the plains at dusk when the light turned everything golden and you could almost forget how much your feet hurt. "I've never been further west than Dodge City," she told him one evening. "The country gets bigger past Dodge," he said. "The sky starts to feel like it belongs to something larger than people." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite name. "That sounds like it could be either wonderful or very lonely," she said. Both, he said simply. Most of the best things are. After that she looked at him differently. Not more warmly exactly, because she had always looked at him with a certain warmth, but more attentively, as if she was reading something she had previously been skimming. 10 days after she arrived in Caldwell, Lavinia opened a letter from Edna that contained better news. Roy's back was healing better than the doctor had expected. He was on his feet again, still limited, but on his feet. Edna wrote that she was sorry for the earlier letter, that she wished things had been different, and that she hoped Lavinia was finding her footing wherever she was. Lavinia wrote back and told her she was fine, that she had found work, that Caldwell was not what she had expected, but that she was managing. She did not mention Lewis Thatcher. She barely mentioned him to herself. But he was there, in the small hotel room when she lay awake at night listening to the prairie wind, in the way she planned the evening's menu with a little more attention to what she had noticed he liked, in the way she caught herself smiling at something he had said hours after he had said it. It had been a warm and quiet Thursday evening when the thing that changed everything happened, and it happened because of a man named Cole Briggs. Cole Briggs was a drover who came in off the trail with 4 of his companions, and unlike Lewis Thatcher, Cole Briggs had started the evening's drinking before he arrived at the Drover's Rest. He was a broad man with small eyes and a loud laugh, and he had been working one of the other outfits on the trail south of town, and he seemed to believe that paying for his whiskey gave him rights over everything in the establishment, including the woman bringing it. He caught Lavinia by the wrist when she passed his table, not violently, but firmly, with the particular entitlement of a man who expects the world to agree that what he wants is reasonable. "Sit down a minute," he said, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes. "I'm working," Lavinia said. Her voice was perfectly level. She had dealt with men like this before, and her strategy had always been to be calm and firm and direct, and to reserve the derringer in her boot for the cases where those 3 things failed. "Work can wait," Cole said, and tightened his grip slightly. "Let go of her arm." The voice came from the end of the bar, and it was quiet, even, and carried through the noise of the room the way a single clear note carries through muddle. Lavinia did not need to look to know who it was. She could feel the whole room shift its attention. Lewis Thatcher had stood up from his bar stool, and he was looking at Cole Briggs with the focused, unhurried expression of a man who has made a calculation and is satisfied with the result. Cole Briggs looked at him with the particular irritation of someone who has been interrupted at the moment of getting what he wanted. "Mind your business, friend." "I'm minding it," Lewis said. He took 1 step forward, not aggressive, just present, putting himself into the geometry of the situation. "Let go of her arm." There was a silence that stretched for 2 full seconds while Cole Briggs weighed his options, and whatever he found in Lewis Thatcher's expression during those 2 seconds was evidently not encouraging, because he released Lavinia's wrist and leaned back in his chair, and made a sound that was designed to suggest that letting go had been his idea all along. "Just being friendly," Cole muttered. "Be friendly somewhere else," Lewis said, and he did not move until Cole Briggs and his companions had gotten up and paid me and left through the front door. Then he turned and looked at Lavinia, and there was something in his eyes now that had not been there before, a kind of fierce, careful attention. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and then, because she wanted to be honest with him and because he seemed like someone who would appreciate honesty, she said, "Thank you. I had it in hand, but thank you." "I know you did," he said. "I could see that. I just didn't want to wait to find out." She looked at him for a moment in the lamplight, in the settling noise of the room returning to itself around them, and she felt the thing in her chest that she had been trying not to feel with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable in its directness. "I'll bring you more coffee," she said, because she had to say something practical, and she went back to the kitchen and leaned against the work table and pressed her hand to her heart like that would accomplish anything at all. The following Sunday, which was Lavinia's day off from the Drover's Rest, she found herself sitting on the bench outside the hotel in the thin morning sunshine with a cup of coffee she had purchased from the cafe across the street, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once, when Lewis Thatcher appeared at the end of Exchange Avenue on horseback. He spotted her and he did something she had not expected, which was to change his direction and ride toward her and dismount and tie his horse to the hitching post and sit down on the other end of the bench without being asked. "I didn't know this was your day off," he said. "It is," she said. "Mine too, more or less. Harlan doesn't need me until Monday." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, which was unusual with people she had known for under 2 weeks, but with him it felt natural in a way she had stopped trying to explain to herself. "Where were you going?" she asked. "Nowhere specific," he said. "I sometimes ride out past the edge of town on Sundays. The country's different when you're not working in it." She looked at him. "Could I come?" He looked back at her, and she could see something shift in those dark brown eyes, some careful thing moving aside to let something else through. "I'd like that," he said. They rode out together past the edge of Caldwell, where the town gave way to the rolling sea of the prairie, the buffalo grass low and gold in the late April light, and the sky above impossibly, extravagantly blue. Bess moved easily alongside Lewis's big gray gelding, whose name, Lewis told her, was August, because he had gotten him in that month 3 years ago. It was an unexpectedly sentimental reason for a name, and Lavinia noticed it and filed it away in the growing collection of small things she was learning about Lewis Thatcher that did not match the exterior he showed the world. They rode for perhaps an hour without talking very much, and it was enough to be in the open air together with the wind pushing through the grass in long, soft waves and the hawks turning slow circles overhead. But then Lavinia began to talk, and once she started she found she could not stop, and she told him about St. Louis, about the man with clean hands and borrowed money whose debts had consumed her savings, about the boarding house and the Derringer and the 6 weeks of moving west. She told him about her mother's biscuits and her 4 brothers and the father who had left when she was 12 and had never come back. She told him about Edna's letter, both of them, the one that had frightened her and the one that had given her some relief. She had not told anyone any of this since she had left Missouri. He listened without interrupting, which was both the rarest and most valuable kind of listening, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You've been carrying all of that alone." "I've been fine," she said, which was the reflex answer, and then she stopped herself and said, "I've been managing." "Which is different from fine." "Yes," he said, "I know the difference." She looked at him. "Your wife," she said carefully, "me told me." "Eleanor," he said. Her name in his mouth was spoken with a particular quality, not raw grief, but the kind of settled sorrow that has been lived with long enough to become a feature of the landscape. "It's been 4 years. I'm not broken by it anymore, but it changed the shape of things." "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it entirely. "I am too," he said. "She was good. She deserved more time." They rode on in silence for a while after that, but it was a different silence, fuller somehow. The silence of 2 people who have shown each other something real and are deciding what to make of it. On the ride back, with the afternoon light going golden and warm around them, Lewis said, "Would you ride out with me again next Sunday?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. They did it again the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and what started as a ride became a picnic the 3rd week when Lavinia packed cornbread and dried beef and a jar of Me's pickles, and they sat on a blanket on a rise above the creek that ran east of town and ate and talked for 3 hours while the horses grazed nearby. She learned that he could read, that he had read more than most people assumed a cowhand would, dog-eared paperback novels that he carried in his saddlebag and traded at general stores along the trail. She learned that he had a younger sister named Ruth in Texas who was married and had 2 children he had never met because the drives always took him north in spring and back south in fall, and there was never time to stop in the right places. She learned that he was, underneath the quiet and the self-containment, a man of considerable warmth and humor, the kind of humor that was dry and understated and arrived when you were not expecting it, which was the best kind. He learned that she was stubborn in a way that was productive rather than merely difficult, that she had opinions about everything, and was willing to argue them with anyone including him, which he seemed to find genuinely delightful. He learned that she had a habit of picking up interesting rocks and carrying them in her jacket pocket until they were too heavy, at which point she would line them up somewhere and leave them. He learned that she was afraid of almost nothing practical but deeply afraid of being trapped by circumstance, by other people's decisions, by the closing of options that had once seemed open. "That's why you left, St. Louis," he said one afternoon, not accusingly, just putting the pieces together. "I stayed too long already," she said. "I kept thinking things would get better, or he would change, or I would find a way to make it work. And one day I just understood that waiting for something to be different was the same as choosing it to stay the same." "That's a hard thing to understand," he said. "It was a hard day," she agreed. "But you left." "I left," she said, "and I'm here." He looked at her across the blanket with the afternoon sun turning his face warm and his eyes very clear, and he said, "I'm glad you're here." And she felt it again, that tremor, that small seismic thing in the region of her heart, and this time she let herself feel it fully instead of pressing it down, and it was terrifying and wonderful in exactly the measure he had said about the country west of Dodge City. It was me, Duffy, who said what no one had said out loud. One morning in the kitchen, when Lavinia was humming to herself, while she turned bacon in the skillet, which was apparently something she had not been doing before. "You're very cheerful this morning," me observed. "Am I?" Lavinia said. "You've been cheerful most mornings lately," me said, cutting bread with the efficient strokes of someone who has been cutting bread for 40 years. "For about 3 weeks, I'd say." Lavinia did not say anything. "Lewis Thatcher is a good man," me said. "He's also the kind of man who doesn't do anything lightly. If he's spending his Sundays with you, it means something to him." "We're friends," Lavinia said. Me made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a scoff but contained elements of both. "All right," she said and let it go. But Lavinia stood at the skillet and thought about it, and she admitted to herself what she had been skirting around for the better part of a month, which was that she was falling in love with Lewis Thatcher. She was not sliding into it gently the way she had expected love to come if it came at all. She was falling the way you fall from a height, that sudden vertiginous commitment to a direction that is simultaneously frightening and completely inevitable. The question was what to do about it. What she did was nothing, for another week, because the question of what Lewis felt seemed uncertain, and she was not willing to make herself vulnerable to something she was not sure of. She had spent enough time giving herself to situations that did not deserve her. She intended to be more careful now. But then she came around the corner from the kitchen one evening and walked into the main room and found Lewis already there, which was not unusual, except that on this particular evening, he was standing near the window at the far end of the room, and he was looking at the door with an expression that she recognized before he saw her and rearranged it. He had been waiting for her to come out, watching the door with an expression that was naked in its hopefulness, the look of someone who is not yet sure they have the right to feel what they are feeling but is feeling it regardless. He saw her a moment later and the expression shifted back into its usual composed, warm attentiveness, and he lifted his coffee in a small greeting. And Lavinia thought, all right then. She brought his coffee out herself, as she always did, and when she set it down, she did not immediately turn to go back to the kitchen. She stood there for a moment, and he looked up at her with a question in his eyes that he had not asked out loud. "I was thinking," she said, "that next Sunday we might ride a little further out, past the creek. I'd like to see what's out there." "I can show you," he said, and he was not talking only about the country, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so, and they did not need to. The following Sunday they rode further out than they had before, past the creek and up into a long rise of land where the grass was taller, and the cottonwoods grew in a line along a shallow draw, and the town of Caldwell was only a distant smudge on the horizon behind them. They left the horses in the shade of the cottonwoods and walked along the draw in the comfortable way of people who have gotten used to the rhythm of each other's company. They talked for a while and then they were quiet. And then Lewis stopped walking and she stopped too. And she turned to look at him and found him looking at her with that same expression she had seen through the window, unguarded and honest and carrying more than he had been saying with words. "Lavinia," he said. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to a question he had asked yet but was nonetheless an answer. He reached out and very carefully, as if he was certain that a wrong move would break something irreplaceable, he took her hand. His thumb traced a small, slow circle on the inside of her wrist, and the touch was so gentle and so deliberate that she felt it everywhere, that single careful motion spreading warmth up her arm and into her chest, and into all the careful, guarded places she had been protecting. "I haven't felt this way about anyone," he said, "since before Eleanor died. And I wasn't sure I would again. I wasn't sure I wanted to because it's frightening knowing what you can lose." He looked at her directly, not looking away. "But I want to try if you do." She thought about St. Louis. She thought about the man with clean hands and borrowed money. She thought about 6 weeks of moving west with a derringer in her boot, and a letter she was afraid to open. She thought about the way she had come to a strange town with nothing and had found, against all reasonable expectation, a man who listened when she talked, who rode with her on Sundays, who had stood up for her without being asked, and acknowledged afterward that she had it in hand. "I'm frightened too," she said. "But I've been frightened before, and it has never stopped me." He exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding that breath for a while, and he brought her hand up and pressed his lips very briefly to her knuckles, and it was such a small gesture, and it undid her entirely. She stepped forward and put her free hand against his chest, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the shade of the cottonwoods with the wind in the grass and the hawk still turning overhead, and it was quiet and warm and absolutely certain. When he kissed her, it was careful and warm and completely without reservation, and she kissed him back with all the directness that was her fundamental nature, and the horses stood peacefully in the shade and did not seem to find any of this remarkable at all. The weeks that followed were the happiest Lavinia had been in years, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it even when happiness felt like a vulnerability she had not planned for. Lewis came to the Drovers' Rest every evening as he always had, and now there was a quality to their conversations that was different, warmer, more open, as if a window had been raised that had previously been stuck. He told her things he had not told people before, and she told him things she had not told people before, and they discovered in the process that they were more similar in the deep structural ways than either of them had expected. The cattle market improved in late May, which meant that Harlan Cross began talking about moving the herd north to complete the drive, which meant that Lewis would be leaving. He told her on a Tuesday evening, leaning across the bar with his coffee in front of him, and his expression carrying the care of someone delivering news that matters. "Harlan wants to push north end of the week," he said. "We'll cross into Kansas territory proper and get to Wichita in maybe 2 weeks." Lavinia absorbed this. She had known it was coming in the abstract way that you know unpleasant truths are coming when you have chosen not to look directly at them. The cattle drives did not last forever. Men who drove cattle moved on. This was simply the nature of the work. "And then?" she asked. "Then the herd gets sold, the men get paid, and we go back south." He looked at her steadily. "I'll be back through Caldwell on the return, maybe mid-July, maybe sooner if the drive is fast." "Maybe," she said. "I want it to be a certainty," he said. "I want there to be something certain between us before I go, so that maybe doesn't have to be the word we use." She looked at him for a long moment. The bar was busy around them, the usual evening noise of the Drovers' Rest, and neither of them seemed to notice it particularly. "What are you saying?" she asked, because she wanted to hear him say it clearly. "I'm saying that I would like to know when I come back through Caldwell in July whether you'd consider coming south with me, to Texas, to stay." He paused. "I'm saying I'd like to give you a reason to be here when I get back, a real reason, not just employment and not just hope." "Lewis," she said. "I know it's fast," he said. I know we've known each other less than 2 months, and the world is full of men who said things quickly and meant them slowly or not at all. I'm not asking you to say yes to everything tonight. I'm only asking if you'd be willing to think about it." She thought about it. She thought about it right there, with him watching her, because she was not a woman who liked to delay clarity when clarity was available. She thought about Texas, which she had never been to, and about a life that was different from the one she had been living, and about the way she felt when she was with him, like the best version of herself, straightforward and warm and unafraid. "Come back in July," she said. "Come back in July and ask me properly." He smiled then, a full, unguarded smile that she had not seen from him before, because it was the kind of smile a person keeps for moments when the world has exceeded their expectations. "I will," he said. The last few days before the drive left were sweet and a little aching, the particular flavor of time when you know something is about to change, and you want to absorb as much of the present as possible before it does. They rode out together one more Sunday, and sat by the cottonwood draw and talked until the light went long and golden, and the prairie darkened to purple at the edges. He gave her something before he left, a small thing, a silver dollar that had been bent slightly on one edge, which he told her he had carried for 7 years because a woman in a town in Texas had pressed it into his hand when he was 23 and newly on the trail, and had told him it was luck. "It's been good luck," he said, "but I think you might need it more than I do for a while." She turned it over in her fingers and looked up at him. "I don't need luck," she said. "No," he agreed. "Keep it anyway." She kept it in the watch pocket of her jacket, where she could feel it when she pressed her hand to her side, which she found herself doing often in the weeks that followed. The weeks after Lewis left were not empty, because Lavinia was not a woman who allowed her interior life to create a vacancy in her exterior one. She continued her work at the Drover's Rest with the same efficiency and care she had always brought to it. And me Duffy, who was observant enough to notice the slight shift in Lavinia's expression when certain subjects came up but too tactful to poke at it directly, kept her busy in ways that were genuinely useful. The spring was turning into summer, and the trail traffic was at its peak, and the Drover's Rest was full every evening with cowboys coming and going. And Lavinia's cooking had developed a small local reputation that brought in regular customers from the town itself as well as the trail. She wrote a letter to Edna and told her a little about Lewis. Not everything, but enough for Edna to understand the shape of it. Edna wrote back with characteristic enthusiasm and a series of questions that made Lavinia smile. She also, in the long evenings after the Drover's Rest closed, and she sat in her small hotel room, thought seriously and carefully about what she wanted. This was something she had not done enough of in the years before St. Louis, that clear-eyed stock-taking of what she actually wanted as opposed to what seemed available or what someone else wanted for her. She thought about Texas. She thought about a life that was more rooted than the one she had been living, not trapped the way she had been trapped before, but rooted in the way of something chosen freely and held onto firmly. She thought about Lewis Thatcher's hands and his laugh, and the way he said her name, and the silver dollar bent on one edge. And she thought that she had probably already made her decision, but was waiting for him to come back and ask so that she could make it out loud. He came back in July, earlier than she had expected. It was the 15th of July. A hot Monday afternoon with the sky a blazing white and the dust of Exchange Avenue rising in small clouds with every footfall. When she looked up from the front of the Drover's Rest, where she was beating a rug against the porch rail, and saw him riding up the street toward her on August, the gray gelding, with the trail dust still on him, and his hat pushed back the way it always was. She set down the rug and he swung down from August and tied him to the post and walked toward her, and they looked at each other for a moment in the hot white afternoon light. "You came back early," she said. "The drive went well," he said. "I didn't want to wait." She felt the silver dollar through the fabric of her jacket where she always kept it. She felt the warmth of the afternoon and the wind off the prairie and the familiar noise of Caldwell going about its business around them, and she felt perfectly, completely certain. "You said you'd ask me properly when you came back," she said. He took his hat off and held it in one hand and looked at her with everything he had in his expression, no part of it held back. "Lavinia," he said, "I've been thinking about you every day since I left. I thought about the way you talk and the way you move and the way you sat in that saddle like you were born to it. And I thought about the silver dollar and the cottonwood draw and the fact that you told me you'd been frightened before and it had never stopped you." He paused. "I'm asking if you would marry me, if you would come to Texas and build something with me. I know I'm a man who works a hard trade, and I know the life isn't easy, but I will be good to you, and I will not let you be trapped, and I will spend every day worth you having me." The rug was leaning against the porch railing. The street was full of ordinary afternoon activity. Me Duffy was almost certainly watching from inside the Drover's Rest. "Yes," Lavinia said, "I will." He reached out and took both of her hands, and he was smiling, that full, unguarded smile she had been given only once before, and she was smiling too, and the hot July afternoon suddenly seemed like the most beautiful weather she had ever experienced in her life. Me Duffy, who had been watching from inside the Drover's Rest, appeared in the doorway with her arms folded, and an expression that contained approximately equal amounts of satisfaction and amusement. "I've been waiting for this for 6 weeks," she said. "I will absolutely not pretend otherwise." They were married 3 weeks later in the small Methodist church on the east end of Caldwell, a ceremony that was simple and honest and attended by Me Duffy, and the Drover's Rest regulars, and the hotel clerk with the spectacles, and several cowboys from the Cross outfit who had been at loose ends between drives. The minister was a round, red-faced man who performed the ceremony with great enthusiasm and only slightly too much dramatic emphasis, and Lavinia wore her best dress, which was dark blue with small white buttons down the front, and Lewis wore his cleanest shirt and a jacket he had purchased specifically for the occasion from the general store, and when he put the ring on her finger, a plain silver band he had found at the jeweler's 2 doors down from the hotel, she felt the certainty again. Solid and clear and completely without doubt. Afterward, Me threw a small celebration in the Drover's Rest that involved her best whiskey and the biscuit recipe that had started everything. And someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing on the floorboards until very late in the evening. And Lavinia danced with Lewis and with me, and with 2 elderly cowboys who danced with the careful, respectful energy of men who had not danced in a long time, and the whole evening had the quality of something genuinely precious. Late that night, sitting together in the warm quiet of the room Lewis had taken at the hotel, with Caldwell settled into its nighttime noises outside the window, Lavinia turned the silver dollar over in her fingers and set it on the washstand where the lamplight caught it. "Still good luck?" Lewis asked. "Better than ever," she said. They left Caldwell in early August when the summer heat had begun its slow recession, and the light had taken on that long, soft quality that late summer brings to the plains. Lavinia packed her saddlebag and said goodbye to Me Duffy, who embraced her firmly and pressed a folded paper into her hand that contained the recipe for her best apple preserves, telling her she would need it in Texas. Lavinia promised to write, and Me said she would believe it when she saw the letter, which was Me's way of saying she trusted it completely. They rode south together on August and Bess, the roan mare, and the country changed around them as they moved, the Kansas grasslands shifting gradually into the rougher, more dramatic landscape of Indian Territory and then Texas, the sky getting bigger as Lewis had promised it would, the horizon extending itself in every direction, until it felt like the world had expanded to accommodate something that could not fit in smaller spaces. It was a long journey, taken in stages, camping in the evenings beside creek beds and cook fires, and these nights on the trail were some of the best things Lavinia would remember for the rest of her life. The fire and the stars and the sound of the horses nearby and Lewis's voice in the dark telling her about the country they were crossing, naming rivers and landmarks and the history of the land they moved through. She was aware, in those evenings, of the fact that this land was not simply empty country, that the Comanche and the Kiowa had lived and ranged across these plains for generations, and that the cattle drives and the settlements were part of a process that had displaced and harmed people whose claim to this land was far older than any document any government had written. She said as much to Lewis one evening, and he was quiet for a moment, and then said that he knew it and had never been entirely comfortable with it, that the injustice was real and had been compounded year by year, and that he did not have a clean answer for it, but that acknowledging it was at least the beginning of honesty. It was not a complete answer, because there was no complete answer, but the fact that he gave it seriously and without defensiveness was something she respected enormously. Lewis's property was in southern Texas, in a valley east of San Antonio, where the land was greener than the open plains, and a creek ran year-round through a stand of live oaks. The house was small, a simple two-room structure with a covered porch and a well and a barn that was in better shape than the house, which told you something about the priorities of a working rancher. There was a kitchen garden that had gone somewhat wild in Lewis's absence, and a chicken yard with a handful of survivors who appeared deeply relieved to see a human being again. Lavinia stood on the porch in the warm Texas evening and looked out at the valley below and listened to the creek and the cicadas and smelled the dry grass and the live oak and thought, "This is mine now. This is ours." She began remaking the house immediately, not because it was wrong, but because she was someone who needed to put her hands on things and improve them, and the house needed improving. Lewis helped when he could and got out of the way when she was in a mood that required independence, which was a quality in him she appreciated more every day. Within a month, the kitchen garden was producing properly, and the house had new curtains she had made from fabric purchased in the nearest town, a small settlement called Creston 6 miles east, and the porch had been repaired, and a rocking chair had been added to its right side. She wrote to Edna and told her where she had ended up. Edna wrote back with great excitement and said she planned to visit as soon as Roy was well enough to leave, which would hopefully be in the spring. Lewis resumed the work of running his small cattle operation, which was not a large thing, a herd of perhaps 80 head that grazed the valley and the surrounding grassland, supplying beef to the settlement at Creston and to a broker in San Antonio who came through twice a year. He had a hand named Hector, a quiet Mexican man of about 40 who had worked for Lewis for 3 years, and who received Lavinia with the careful courtesy of someone who was genuinely welcoming, but was not yet sure what place she occupied in the established order of things. Within a week she had figured out that Hector's primary language was Spanish and that he was somewhat self-conscious about his English, and she began, with the directness that was her fundamental mode, asking him to teach her Spanish words for things around the ranch, and within 2 weeks they were getting along with an ease that Lewis observed from a distance with obvious delight. "He never talked that much before," Lewis told her one evening. "You have a gift for making people comfortable." "I ask them about things they know," she said. "Everyone relaxes when they're the expert." He looked at her with that particular warmth that she had come to recognize as the look he reserved for moments when she had said something that went straight to the center of some truth he had been circling. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "4 brothers," she said. "You learn quickly what makes people willing to be around you and what doesn't." They settled into the rhythm of the ranch with the natural ease of 2 people who are suited to each other's company. And Lavinia found that she liked Texas, liked it in a way that surprised her given that she had come from a city and had spent the last years of her life in transit. The landscape was different from the Kansas plains, more textured, more varied, and the live oak valley was beautiful in a way that she kept noticing fresh every morning, the particular quality of the light through the oak leaves, and the sound of the creek and the big, warm Texas sky. She had not expected to feel rooted anywhere again, and she did, deeply and firmly, and with a gratitude that was sometimes overwhelming in its simplicity. The autumn passed in the work of the ranch and the slow building of a life together, and by November Lavinia knew she was expecting their first child. She told Lewis on a Sunday evening on the porch, which had become their place for the important conversations, the same way the Sundays in Caldwell had been their time. He was very still for a moment when she told him, and then he put his face in his hands, not in distress, but in the way of someone who has received something so significant that they need a moment to let it expand to its proper size. When he looked up, his eyes were bright, and he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I'm perfectly well," she said, "a little tired, but perfectly well." He reached across and took her hand and held it with both of his, and he said, "I want you to know that I'm going to be here for all of it, whatever you need. I'm not going north in the spring." "Lewis," she said, "you don't have to give up the drives." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to." She looked at him in the evening light and felt the thing in her chest that had been growing since Caldwell, that tremor that had become something larger and more solid, something that had taken root and was no longer trembling but simply present, steady and warm and absolutely certain. The winter in southern Texas was mild compared to what she had known in Missouri and Kansas, and she spent it reading and cooking and learning more Spanish from Hector and corresponding with Edna, who was delighted by the news of the expected baby, and who reported that Roy was nearly fully recovered and that they were managing the homestead well now. Lavinia also, quietly and without making a project of it, began improving her skills with the rifle Lewis kept by the back door, because she was not a woman who intended to be helpless in any situation, and Lewis took her out to the creek bank on several evenings to practice, and she improved quickly, which pleased her and impressed him in equal measure. Their son was born in June of 1879, in the small bedroom of the ranch house, with the creek audible through the open window, and the summer insects loud in the live oaks, attended by a midwife from Creston named Josephine, who had delivered approximately 200 children in 30 years, and who treated the whole enterprise with a brisk, warm competence that Lavinia found enormously reassuring. Lewis was in the front room for most of it, which was where Josephine firmly directed him, and Lavinia could hear him pacing, the floorboards speaking his anxiety in a steady rhythm, and she found it both endearing and slightly amusing even at the most difficult moments. The boy was born healthy and loud, and Lewis was brought in with the careful speed of a man who has been waiting outside a door and knows it, and he stood over the small wrapped bundle Josephine placed in Lavinia's arms and looked at their son with an expression that Lavinia had no words for, pure and undefended and enormous. "He's remarkable," Lewis said, which was an objectively true assessment. They named him Thomas, after Lewis's father, who had died when Lewis was 20, and whom Lewis had spoken of with a quiet reverence that told Lavinia everything she needed to know about the kind of man his father had been. Thomas Thatcher was, as babies go, vigorous and opinionated, which surprised no one who knew his mother. He grew into a solid, curious boy with Lewis's dark eyes and Lavinia's auburn hair, and a temperament that combined the best of both his parents, direct and warm, and with a fondness for being outdoors that expressed itself as early as he could walk. Hector was particularly devoted to him, teaching him words in Spanish with the patient enthusiasm of a man who had decided this child was partly his responsibility, and Thomas grew up comfortable in both languages, which Lavinia considered one of the greatest gifts of his early years. Edna came to visit in the spring of 1880 with Roy, who was walking steadily with a cane, and who turned out to be a tall, gentle man with a beard and an air of quiet gratitude about him, and their 2 children, a girl of 7 and a boy of 5. The small ranch house was crowded and lively for 2 weeks, and Lavinia watched her cousin move through the kitchen and the garden and sit with Lewis in the evening on the porch and felt a rightness about it, the way good things that have been working themselves toward each other finally arrive in the same place. Edna pulled her aside on the second day and held both her hands and said, "You are happy." "I am," Lavinia said. "I am sorry about the letter," Edna said. "The first one, I am sorry I could not, it was exactly right," Lavinia interrupted gently. "If you had said yes, I would not have had to keep going. I would not have gotten to Caldwell. I would not have gotten to any of this." She squeezed Edna's hands. "It turned out to be the best thing you could have done for me." Edna wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron, which was a very Edna thing to do, and then composed herself with equal speed, which was also a very Edna thing to do. The visit ended with genuine reluctance on both sides and the firm promise of letters and a return visit the following spring, and Lavinia stood on the porch and watched the wagon carrying Edna and Roy and their children diminish down the valley road until it disappeared, and she felt the fullness of the life she had built, its texture and warmth, and the way it had grown from almost nothing into something this substantial. In the years that followed, the ranch grew steadily. Lewis made careful decisions about expanding the herd, and by 1881 they had 140 head and a second hand. A young man named Daniel who had come up from further south and who was learning cattle work with the serious enthusiasm of someone who understands he is learning a trade. The house was extended with a second room added on the back, giving Thomas a proper bedroom and giving Lavinia the space for the desk she had wanted, where she could write her letters and keep the household accounts, and increasingly correspond with a woman in San Antonio who ran a small charitable organization that provided food and clothing to families displaced by the ongoing upheaval of the frontier. Work that Lavinia had found through a chance conversation in Creston and had immediately recognized as something she needed to be part of. Lewis supported this without reservation, which she had expected, but which she appreciated deeply every time he demonstrated it. He was not a man who needed his wife to be small so that he could feel large. He seemed genuinely to want the fullest version of her available, which was a thing she had not known to look for, and which turned out to be everything. Their daughter was born in the autumn of 1882, a stormy September night with rain on the roof and lightning over the valley, which Josephine said was good luck, and which Lavinia believed because she was willing to believe in good luck now in a way she had not always been. The girl arrived with the same enthusiasm Thomas had shown, and a quantity of dark hair that she had clearly taken from Lewis's side of the equation. Lewis held her in the lamplight in the small bedroom with the rain still coming down outside and looked at his daughter with the same enormous expression he had turned on Thomas 3 years before, that pure, undefended thing that he only ever showed completely with Lavinia and their children. "What shall we call her?" he asked. "Margaret," Lavinia said. "For your sister." Ruth had mentioned their mother in a letter, and the name had felt right, had felt like something offered across the distance. Lewis's sister Ruth and her family had come to visit the previous summer, a trip long overdue, and the children had met their cousins, and there had been the building of something that had been delayed too long by geography and the demands of work. "Margaret," Lewis said, trying the name out in the same way he had said Lavinia's name the first time she introduced herself, with care and attention, as if it mattered how words landed. "Yes." It was December of 1883, when Lewis sat down at the kitchen table one evening with a piece of paper and the expression of a man who has been thinking about something for a long time and has decided the time has come to say it. Thomas was 4.5 and had been put to bed an hour ago. Margaret was a year old and asleep in the back room with a firmness that suggested she had decided she was done with wakefulness for the evening and would brook no argument. The ranch was quiet in the particular way of a winter night, the creek lower and slower than in summer, and the wind gentle and cool through the live oak leaves. Lavinia was at her desk writing a letter to the San Antonio woman, whose name was Clara Reeves, about a delivery of blankets they had arranged for a group of families in the hill country who were struggling through a hard winter. She looked up when Lewis sat down at the table with his piece of paper. "What is that?" she said. "I've been thinking about the north pasture," he said. "I think if we fence it properly and put in a windmill to improve the water access, we could run 30 more head without overgrazing the valley land." She came and sat across from him, and they bent over the paper together, the lamplight warm between them, and they talked about the north pasture and the windmill and what it would cost and how long it would take. And somewhere in the middle of the conversation about fence posts and water rights, Lewis looked up and found her looking at him, and the conversation paused. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I was just thinking about Caldwell." He considered this. "What about it?" "I was thinking about the morning I rode in," she said, "with a cracked saddlebag and a letter I was afraid to open, and I was thinking about how I had no idea." She looked at him across the lamplight, across the paper covered in his neat handwriting, across the table in the kitchen of the house that was theirs in the valley of the live oaks. "I had absolutely no idea what was waiting." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Neither did I. I came into the Drover's Rest for coffee and the best biscuits in Kansas, and I left with the conviction that the world had just offered me something I did not deserve." "You deserved it," she said. "So did you," he said. Outside the window, the Texas night was wide and full of stars, the sky doing what it did in this country, which was to exceed the expectations of anyone looking up at it for the first time or the 1,000th time with equal indifference to repetition. The creek moved in its quiet winter way. The horses were settled in the barn. The children were asleep. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his hand over and held hers in the easy, natural way of people who have held each other's hands so many times that the gesture has become a kind of vocabulary, saying things that don't need to be put into other words. "About the windmill," she said. "Yes," he said, picking up the pencil. "I think we should do it," she said. "But I also think we should plant more of that kitchen garden on the east side. There's a woman in Creston who showed me how to put in squash, and it needs more space than I've been giving it." He nodded, writing notes. "We can do both." "We usually can," she said, and he smiled without looking up, and it was the full, unguarded smile, and she loved him with the totality of everything she was, loved him with the same completeness and certainty with which she had said yes on a hot July afternoon in Caldwell with a rug in her hand and a silver dollar in her pocket and a whole life still to be built. The years were good ones, taken in the whole. There were hard moments, as there always are in a life that is lived rather than merely managed. There was a drought in the summer of 1884 that worried the creek down to almost nothing and required harder decisions about the herd than either of them liked making. There was a winter when Thomas had a bad fever that kept Lavinia and Lewis both awake for 5 days until it broke and he was himself again. And the relief of that morning was as profound as anything she had felt in her life. Hector's wife, a woman from San Antonio named Dolers who had come to live on the ranch in 1880 with their 2 daughters, lost a baby in the spring of 1885, and Lavinia sat with Dolers through the worst of that grief and found that grief has no language barriers when it is felt and witnessed honestly. But the good things were more than the hard things, and the good things were very good. Thomas, at 6, could ride better than many adults and was developing a ferocious curiosity about every living thing on the ranch, a curiosity that expressed itself in detailed interrogations of anyone who seemed to have relevant knowledge. He had taken to following Hector's eldest daughter, Elena, who was 12 and deeply knowledgeable about medicinal plants, through the valley asking questions about every green growing thing, which Elena bore with the patient good humor of someone who had younger siblings and understood that small people needed to be answered. Margaret, at 3, was determinedly physical, climbing everything she could climb and standing at the top with an expression of immense satisfaction, and she had her father's quietness combined with her mother's determination in a mixture that suggested she would be, in time, utterly unstoppable. On an evening in the autumn of 1885, with the live oaks turned and the light in the valley golden and horizontal. Lavinia sat in the rocking chair on the porch and watched Lewis and Thomas and Hector moving the horses into the barn for the evening, the sound of their voices coming to her across the yard in pieces. And Margaret was asleep on her lap, heavy and warm in the particular boneless way of sleeping children. And Lavinia pressed her hand to the watch pocket of her jacket where the silver dollar still lived, bent on one edge, 7 years of luck distributed generously. She had come to Caldwell with nothing. She had been afraid to open a letter. She had walked into a town full of hard men and uncertain futures with a derringer in her boot, and a recipe for biscuits in her memory, and a determination not to be defeated by circumstances that were not her fault and not of her choosing. She had found me Duffy, who had given her work and honesty. She had found, on an evening in late April when the sky outside was the color of a bruise, a man who ordered coffee instead of whiskey and who had dark brown eyes and a quiet that was earned rather than threatening, and who had looked at her like she surprised him and then looked away, which was the beginning of everything. Lewis came across the yard toward the porch, brushing his hands on his jeans, and he looked up at her in the rocking chair with Margaret asleep in her arms, and his expression did the thing it did, that full and undefended opening, and he came up the porch steps and sat down on the step just below her level and leaned back against the railing so he was facing out toward the valley with its golden light and its creek and its live oaks, and after a moment he turned his head to look at her. "She's out," he said, nodding at Margaret. "Completely," Lavinia said. He reached up and took her free hand, the one not supporting Margaret, and held it loosely, his thumb making the small, slow circles he had made at the cottonwood draw in the first weeks, when the gesture had been new and careful and full of question. Now it was simply himself, the way he held her hand, and she felt it still in the same way she always had, warm and deliberate and traveling up her arm and into all the places in her that had once been carefully guarded. "I was thinking," he said, looking back out at the valley. She said. "About how this is the best thing," he said, "all of this, however it happened." She looked at the valley, at the live oaks and the low creek and the last of the golden light, and at Thomas coming across the yard toward them with a rock in his hand that he clearly considered very interesting, moving with the confident purpose of a 6-year-old who has found something worth sharing. "Yes," she said simply, "it is." Thomas came up the porch steps and held out the rock, which was striped with some kind of mineral deposit that made it look, he informed them with the authority of an expert, like something that might be important. Lewis examined it seriously and confirmed that it did indeed look important. Lavinia asked what Thomas planned to do with it. Thomas said he was going to put it on the windowsill in his room next to the other rocks, which Lavinia recognized as an inheritance, the same habit she had carried with her from St. Louis through Wichita and Dodge City and Caldwell and all the way to this valley in Texas, the habit of picking up interesting things and carrying them until you found the right place to set them down. She had found the right place. She was home. The silver dollar on the watch pocket stayed warm against her side, and the evening light held the valley in its last long offering of gold, and the creek moved over its stones, and the live oaks stood in their deep-rooted certainty, and the porch held the 4 of them, the sleeping girl and the boy with his important rock and the man with his warm brown eyes, and the woman who had once ridden into a strange town with everything uncertain and a letter she was afraid to open, and had found, against every reasonable expectation, that the world had been building her something she had not known to ask for, and that it was exactly enough and more than enough, and would continue to be so for as long as the valley held light.